Okay, now to consociational democracy, which is at the heart of this literature. What is consociational democracy? It is, first of all, let's look at the cases first. The original consociational democracy, small European democracies, Austria, Belgium, Netherlands, Switzerland, that were the basis for the argument that R. and Leiphart made, that democracies did not have to be of Westminster type. Smaller European democracies are always ignored in the mainstream literature. It is driven by the bigger European countries or North American or United States of America. There is a very important experience, political experience, which smaller European democracies, Austria, Belgium, Netherlands, Switzerland, have gone through, especially after the First World War. Its features have to be studied, and they were of different. First of all, they were all multi-ethnic, or in some cases not multi-ethnic, but the antagonisms between left and right were so deep and so intense that both had to be given recognition or political representation in order for the polity to function, and that happened. So, the features, this is an inductively driven theory, the features of these democracies are, first of all, a grand coalition. All major segments or ethnic groups, segments they use, segments and ethnic groups, because in one of the cases the dispute was between right and left. So all major segments given a seat at the high table in government. Second, a mutual veto. No decision of government without all agreeing. Consensus government. So like WTO in this case. Until all agree, one country has undermined the agreement reached in Bali. That's a veto. That's the idea of mutual veto. Okay, proportionality. Proportionality, so the grand coalition is about executive power, which will be also proportional, but more important, the idea here is that all institutions where power resides, especially assemblies, would be proportional. 25%, if ethnic group A is 25% of a society, of a polity, it would have 25% of representation in the assembly. No 50% plus one deciding who the winner is. And segmental autonomy, this is takes two forms, territorial and non-territorial. Segmental autonomy is, when territorial, is basically federalism. Each group having a state of its own, with sufficient power allocated to the state or provincial level. That's one version of that. That is the territorial part, if they are regionally distributed. The other is, they are not regionally distributed. They're not geographically concentrated. Ethnic groups, they are territorially mixed up. Then non-territorial federalism, and by that they mean each group would have schools of its own, would have places of cultural importance of its own, and given autonomy over it. Laws, this would not be one law for all, except in crime. This would be if a religious group has a notion of polygamy. If polygamy, that religious code allows, then the government will not ban polygamy. In principle, though none of these groups had polygamy. I'm just giving an example of that. Right? So this is the consociational democracy. This is practiced in these places. It lasted in some cases until the late 60s or so. It managed conflict and violence. These were very violent places at one point. And in some cases, it's some form it's lasting even today. Belgium has, people argue, has become non-functional, but Belgium is not violent. If cross-cuttingness dominates pillarization, if there is a lot of cross-cuttingness across these pillars at the ground level, then pillars are not necessary. Then you may not need the system. He does say, however, that if both cross-cuttingness and the pillars exist, that is to say cross-cuttingness is less intense than pillarized identities, then he said it might actually work even better. But if society is completely or heavily cross-cut, right, then this is not needed. But he believes also that multi-ethnic societies are not likely to be very cross-cutting, which is one of the actually arguments, critiques of the theory. And they are likely to be more concerned about their internal lives than about building networks, which is not something, as you will see, I obviously in my book critique this idea. Okay, but one more thing. Beyond European democracies, where has it been practiced? Malaysia is called semi-consociational. So what is called Barisan Nasional, the coalition, the ruling coalition, consists of the Malays, the Chinese and the Indians, the three largest communities. That coalition that runs for office, right? And it has been winning since independence, since the coalition came about after 69 riots, actually. So it's been running Malaysia since 1970. And within the coalition, of course, since Malays are the majority, they have most of the power and they run for most of the seats. But some seats are clearly assigned to the Chinese and the Indians, and also positions in government. So the Chinese and the Indians regularly get some portfolios assigned to them. Right? Why is it semi-consociational? Not consociational? But there's no mutual veto. Malays are dominant. They have developed the system of allocating power according to community, right? And they run for office this way. And the Indians and the Chinese have substantial segmental autonomy, but it is not full segmental autonomy. Malay dominance cannot be questioned in Malaysia. Otherwise, the system unravels. So that's an exception. Now, that is not, therefore, a full consociational system. Lebanon set up a consociational system in 1942. And it collapsed in the late 60s, the Civil War began. Why? It has some important implication for a general argument that will emerge later. What could hold that society together ultimately became entirely counterproductive and a civil war began. When I was growing up in North India, Lebanon was called the poor man's France. People, if you didn't have money to go to Paris, very few Indians had money to go to Paris and for holidays, you actually went to Beirut for your holidays. And Beirut was called the poor man's Paris. Beirut by 1977, Beirut by mid-1980s was an unrecognizable battlefield. Right? Not a Paris. What happened? The shares of power, the weights in power, were assigned on the basis of demographic percentages in 1942. But different communities had different rates of growth. As a result of which, by the mid-1960s, the original weightage made no sense to those who were in larger numbers by now. And those who had become smaller were not willing to concede power to those who were having more children. Right? So it froze weights. It froze weights, and the freezing of weights led to enormous disaffection, and those who argued deserved greater weightage in power because they were larger in number, but started the Civil War. system would not allow any changes. And this is a general critique of the theory, as we'll see later. It basically freezes identities. It freezes identities. It does not allow you. Pratap Bhanu Mehta calls it imposition, state prison of identities, I think is the term he uses. You can freeze identities this way. He thinks that India is doing that, though India is not consociational. He argues the state is really freezing our identities in India, not allowing us to choose our identities in government. Indeed, it has been argued now that this is a very good formula for transitions from highly conflicted, enormously violent, multi-ethnic situations to eventual peace. As a transition, this works well. So you get those who are in a civil war together. You say you are part of the power structure now, but we will agree to do this only for 4 years, 5 years, 3 years, and then we'll have elections, and whoever wins the election runs the government. As a transitional formula, this has been tried out in quite a few places. Right? But other than these cases, you don't have consociational arguments, consociational polities as durable polities. And we'll see in a moment why. In fact, I'll ask you why that is so. So let's first go on to Donald Horowitz and his critique. The electoral system should make it impossible for political parties to win power unless they appeal across ethnic groups, not lock and freeze identities forever. It's the former which is more likely to lead to peace. The latter, freezing and locking identities, is likely to lead to conflict and violence. This is the claim made by another towering figure in this field, Donald Horowitz. These were not only abstract claims, they testified before Mandela, ANC, and others at the time of transition. They testified at the time of transition in Nigeria. So their arguments were not just abstract arguments. They took their arguments to the political field and fought out a battle there. Right? And the South African battle is very well known. Both Aaron Leiphart and Donald Horowitz going to the ANC or requested by ANC to come and present their ideas. And ultimately, the consociational idea was chosen as a transitional idea, not as a durable polity. Now, I want you to use this theory or to reflect on this theory, on the consociational theory and the critiques thereof, by going back to separate electorates, 1909, they begin in India. And what was Jinnah's argument? Jinnah did not use the term consociational. Was Jinnah's argument consociational about consociational democracy or liberal democracy? The term consociational was born only in the late 60s. Was Muhammad Ali Jinnah making consociational arguments? Would anyone recall what the arguments were? What was the argument about sole spokesman? Did Muhammad Ali Jinnah say that only the Muslim League would represent the Muslims of India and the Congress should represent only the Hindus of India? Did he or did he not say that? Not just non-seriously or incidentally, but as a central claim. The answer is? He did say that. The Congress party cannot represent the Muslims of India, only the Muslim League would represent the Muslims of India. Yes? Okay. Did he say that a certain proportion of power at the executive level, in the assemblies, and in the judiciary, and in the bureaucracy would be reserved for Muslims of India? Did he or did he not say that? as a central claim, not an incidental claim. What was the argument? What proportion was what they was going to get? What did Jinnah want? The original claim, very forcefully made for years and years. Some people argue, Ayush Jalal has argued it was simply a bargaining chip. He argued half of all power. They were 25%, Muslims were 25%, but it's should not be according to demographic weight. At the very least, Muslims have contributed, have been equal partners of Hindus in contributing to Indian history and culture. Yes? And Ayush Jalal argues this was bargaining chip, would have come down, etc., and then Congress should have accepted. But could Congress have accepted the claim that it would represent only the Hindus of India? Could it have accepted that claim at all as a basis for peace? The point is that Mr. Jinnah was making a consociational argument, and it was not going to be acceptable to a party which may have declined by now, and declined badly, may not be recognizable as the party that fought for freedom. It was fighting for a multi-religious India. Multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic India. In this case, religion was the main issue. Multi-religious India. It had seen very important Muslim leaders as at the very top, Maulana Azad. In fact, the biggest response to this view in 1940, by the 1940s it's clear, this is a claim on which Jinnah would not budge, right? In 1940, the biggest response to Jinnah's Lahore resolution speech is by Maulana Azad. It's worth reading. It's a classic response, right? So you have Maulana Azad, at least you can think of others who were there, and you had fought for a multi-religious India. And you were not going to accept that you were only representatives of Hindus. This is not how Nehru saw himself. This is not how even Patel saw himself. I've read Patel very carefully. Patel has some Hindu nationalist streak after 1948, roughly or so, which is the time when Gandhi is also becoming uncomfortable with him. But during the Ahmedabad phase of Patel, which I have investigated thoroughly, this is not how he saw himself. That he was representing only Gujarati Hindus or Hindus of India. Right? They were fighting against separate electorates, and they wanted Muslim support. They got some support, they didn't get it fully. Right? They didn't get it fully. After all, Pakistan 1946 elections, Muslim League won 90% of Muslim seats. Of the separate seats, Muslim League won 90% of Muslim seats. Congress fought there and Congress lost. So it's clear that there was a defeat here. Only 12% of India had the right to vote in 1946. We don't know what would have happened if rural Muslims had been asked to vote, or poor Muslims had been asked to vote. We don't know what would have happened. That's the counterfactual history. But at least on the basis of those who had franchise, 12% of India, Congress lost the battle. Right? Congress lost the battle, but that was battle for elections. It is not clear, Congress argued, that it had lost forever. It would still like to represent all Indians. So you got in India, using this theory, a clash between consociational democracy and liberal democracy. Right? That clash that led to the of course partition of India. But ask yourself a counterfactual question. If Jinnah's demand Congress had accepted, would that have guaranteed peace in India? R.N. Leiphart argues, yes, it would have. I said, how do you know? I asked him. How do you know? Why would not India have gone the Lebanon way? What is the guarantee it would have gone the Switzerland way? Right? Two possibilities are there at that time. The Swiss outcome and the Lebanon outcome. Now we can look back and see. What was the guarantee it would have gone the Swiss way? On what basis can we say that? right? Would not have government become immobile? Would not have there been a lot of violence if Congress had accepted the claim that Muslims of India would have 50% of all power at the highest level? Now, I support the idea this is not a Hindu nationalist argument. The argument I'm making is that even a non-Hindu nationalist would say the idea of 50% power reserved for the Muslims would have been a recipe for more violence, not less violence. I can't prove it, but counterfactually that appears to be true to me. That would have happened, right? So neither as a principle, here the issue for them was as a principle they could not concede. There was no way Nehru was going to say, Jawaharlal Nehru represents the Hindus of India only. There was no way that would have happened. Or Gandhi, for that matter, saying something like that. Gandhi, those who believe Gandhi accepted Jinnah's claim, they have to historically prove that. That is in the film, certainly. We don't know whether Gandhi ever accepted that claim. That is some kind of narrative that was floating around. Okay, so that's critique number one. Critique number one is freezing of identities. Freezing of identities, locking identities, locking proportions of power. It's not clear. That can be a recipe for peace. It was peaceful in modern Europe, smaller European democracies. It was not peaceful in Lebanon. And all societies which have experimented with this idea outside Europe have experimented it as a transitional idea, as a way to bring civil warring leaders, or civil war leaders, battling leaders to a table and ask them to share power before a durable polity is put in place with different features, right? Now, the second critique follows from this, and this is very interesting. Leibhardt, in the most recent debate from 2001, yes, that was the last time this was, now accepts that when consociational theory was developed in the 60s and 70s, an essentialist view of identities prevailed. You're quickly getting into this idea, right? That's why you're shaking your head. In line with those times, he also assumed that ethnic identities were fixed and appropriate political institutions were to be constructed in light of the fixity of ethnic identities. The new literature shows that how institutions can transform the salience of identities. If so, the older assumption does not hold. And here is a question for you. Does it mean that the consociational theory about peace is invalid?